Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, thank you. Okay. So welcome to this week's Milbank Forum. I'm really delighted to see you all here and to welcome Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's here this week to discuss her new book, Unfinished Business, Women, Men, Work, Family. Perhaps in that order? I don't know, you'll have to ask her. Anne-Marie is a superstar in a whole range of fields, and we're really thrilled that she's here with us this afternoon. She's currently the president and CEO of New America, which is known to many of you, I think. It's a nonpartisan think tank focusing on a wide range of public policy issues, including education, economics, and technology, among many others. Before joining New America, she served as the director of policy planning within the U.S. State Department, a tremendously important job and an office that she led with great distinction. She received the Secretary's Distinguished Service Award for that work, as well as service awards from the United States Agency for International Development and the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. Prior to that government service, Anne-Marie was the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, and before that, a chaired professor of international foreign and comparative law at Harvard Law School. Educated at Princeton, Oxford, and Harvard for her legal training, but we don't hold that against her. She is an expert in a broad range of fields, having authored 6 books and literally hundreds of scholarly articles. For someone to have done that while also wearing a dean hat embarrasses the rest of us who can't seem to find 30 hours in a day. She's going to discuss this new book with us today that in many ways is an outgrowth of an essay that she published in The Atlantic called Why Women Still Can't Have It All. This became one of the most read articles in the history of the magazine, and it really itself, all by itself, helped renew the debate on obstacles, on challenges to genuine gender equality in the workplace and more broadly in American society. We are very, very grateful to have this enormously accomplished and erudite expert on this issue, among many others, with us today. She is a longtime friend of NYU Law School, so in many ways we're welcoming her home and glad to be doing that. We'll hear from Dr. Slaughter first, and then 2 of our members of the class of 2017, Johnny Husbands and Jessica Moldovan, will have a conversation with Anne-Marie Slaughter. But let's begin by welcoming Anne-Marie.
Thank you. I really do, as Trevor said, I feel like I'm coming home. I have been a visiting professor here. I have visited here in other capacities, and whenever I'm in Washington Square, I feel like this is part of my New York home. So I'm thrilled to see all of you. Let me start this way. I could not have written this book 3 years ago when I wrote my article. I simply could not have written this book because I did not believe then what I believe now. And I've spent 3 years rethinking, reading, talking to audiences like this one, but of all different kinds of groups across the country, challenging my own assumptions, and finally coming out in a quite different place. And along the way, I found out different things even about my own family. So one of my close friends wrote me when the article came out, and she'd grown up with me in Charlottesville, Virginia in the 60s, and she said, you know, your dad was really progressive. He always said you were going to have a career. My dad didn't say that, and none of the dads of our other friends didn't say that. And I'd never really thought about that. I mean, he's my dad, and he talked to me about having a career. I think I told him I wanted to be a lawyer at age 6, and he was a lawyer, and I have lots of lawyers in my family. But I emailed him and I said, so Dad, why were you so progressive? And I thought maybe, he was very close to his mother, and he wrote back with a part of the women's movement that I had read about but completely forgotten. And he said he was a lawyer in Charlottesville, Virginia. In the mid-60s was the first big wave of divorces. And that was partly the women's movement, and that was also the birth control pills. There were a number of reasons, but there he was representing a number of women who had put their husbands through medical school or law school or whatever professional training they went through, who had raised a family, who were now in their 50s, and their husbands were leaving them, and they had absolutely no means of support. And he said, I vowed that my daughter would always be able to support herself. And I start with that because it showed me a different side of my own father. We've always been close, and that has been in part because we shared the professional identity of being both lawyers. We were going to have a firm called Slaughter and Daughter, but it never happened. And I never thought of it more in the side of him as the father who was caring for his daughter. It wasn't about ambition, it was about care. And I also see my mother very differently. So 3 years ago, if you'd asked me about my mother, I'd have said she is a fabulous artist. I'd have told you she had a 40-year retrospective. I'd have told you she has paintings and collections up and down the East Coast and in Europe, and that my house looks like the Museum of Mom's Art. I'd have been very proud of that, and I am very proud of that. But I would never have said to you, and she was a homemaker for 20 years. Indeed, when I was growing up, Mom was at home. She wasn't an artist. She did some painting on the side, but she was not a professional. I would never have told you that. I would have emphasized her professional credentials immediately. I would have thought that telling you that she was a homemaker would lower her in probably your esteem, or you just wouldn't notice. I now look at both my parents in their 80s, and I think my father did great work. You know, there are a lot of clients in Charlottesville who will say he helped them and who will say he was a man of integrity and good character. And I think that's great. I think he can look back on a career and feel really good about his work. But I also look at my mother's work. And I look at the three of us. I have two brothers, and we are all happy, healthy, contributing members of society. We have an incredibly strong family network. I could not do any of all those things that Trevor just told you I've done. I could do none of those without my family as my foundation. And you know, to this day, if something goes wrong with one of us or with one of the grandchildren or whatever, it's the family grapevine. Everybody is immediately alerted. You know, in comes the support, and that's my mother's work. Right? That didn't just happen. That was the time and the energy and the care she put in to raising us to be the people we are and to knitting the bonds between us as a family. So I start with that. I now would tell you very proudly, my mother raised three fabulous children. She is also an artist. And I would say those two things are equal. That's the starting point. So let me kind of go back and talk through some of the themes of the book. So the first, you know, what I wrote about in the article was that I had hit a tipping point. That, you know, here I am, I have every advantage in the world. I have a lead parent husband who is willing to be back in Princeton with our two sons. I have enough money to have a full-time housekeeper. I have, you know, a support system and good schools. I have every advantage in the world. And I cannot make doing the professional work that I want to do, I can't fit that together with the parent I knew I needed to be and that I wanted to be. So I hit a tipping point. And that's not because I wasn't ambitious. I'm very ambitious. And I am very career-oriented, as anybody who has known me will tell you. So it wasn't about not leaning in. It was about hitting a tipping point, even though I had all these advantages. And after I wrote the article, all these other people wrote me incredibly poignant letters about their tipping points. When they had a second child and it just was impossible for their husband or wife to make it go, or a child with special needs, or a divorce, or counting on extended family to raise your kids or to help you with your kids, and then you have to move or a parent passes on. All the things that happen that are not within our control. And when that tipping point happens, what then do we do? That's really the question that motivates the book in many ways, but let me say before plunging into that, this is not in any way to say that Sheryl Sandberg's work is not hugely important. And I make that very clear in the book. And I say, and it's absolutely true, I've had 3 women ask me for raises as CEO, and I know in each case they've just read Lean In. And I think that's actually terrific. And I think she's absolutely right about unconscious bias, about the need to fight it, about taking your seat at the table and raising your hand. Absolutely. It's just that if you lean in without a support system, you will tip over. And that even when you have a support system, often it's not enough. So we need both. This is a both-and argument. This is not an either-or argument. So the core of the book is really that as long as we see this problem, which is a care problem, as a women's issue, we are reinforcing the very problem we need to overcome. That as long as I'm thrilled to see the number of men in this audience. It's the first thing I'm noticed the minute I walk into a room. And this audience looks like a lot of millennial couples wondering, how are we going to negotiate this? How are we going to have a family, care for our parents, care for our children, and both live up to our professional potential? That's the right way to think about this issue. But most of my audiences are still mostly women. And all those women's groups and women's support networks and women's mentorship, all of that reinforces the idea that men and women can earn a living, but it is women's job to raise families. And that is a halfway revolution. That is not a full revolution. And here, I have to just say this, Carol Gilligan's sitting in the front row. Carol Gilligan has been one of my heroes since when I was in law school and read in a different voice and thought, this is my life. It was this understanding of the way I thought that I had not understood before that. But I just have to say that Carol Gilligan's work with members of this faculty have made this argument about being a whole person and about the raising of children and the investing in others being what it is to be human rather than what it is to be female well before me. So I have to acknowledge that, and I just told her I would have quoted her on every page if my editor had let me. So when it's not a woman's problem, it is a care problem. It is the problem that in society, as individuals, as families, as members of the society, we do need to earn a living, but we also need to translate that income into the care of others, right? For whether, again, it's children, it's a spouse, it's your parents. You can choose whether to have children, but you, at least not yet, cannot choose whether or not to have parents. When I'm talking in California, I'm never really sure about that. People are gonna start springing from other people's foreheads like Athena. But the point is, as individuals, we are both caring and competitive beings. Some of us are way over on the competitive side, and some of us are way over on the nurturing side. Most of us are clustered somewhere in the middle. Most of us have that part that wants to advance ourselves and invest in ourselves and is defined as an individual. But we are also defined in relation to someone else. We are a daughter or a mother or a sister or a friend, or a wife. And that is a huge part of our lives. It is essential to our survival as a race, but it is also essential to our growth as human beings. So this is a care issue. It is an issue that whole sphere of human activity has just gotten shunted to one side as the people who used to do it, the women, are now in the workforce out of necessity or out of choice. And instead of saying, yes, well, wait a minute, now we both have to do care. We're both earning a living, so we both have to be the caregivers. We've said, no, that's still women's issues, and it's really their issue to solve. We're not going to change the workplace. We're not going to provide the social supports for care. Here's how to think about it. If you are a woman like the women in this room, and you start off in a law firm, and in many firms, you then take advantage of those flexibility policies that they will tell the women in this audience about, but not the men, because they don't think the men are going to take advantage of them. they will, if you take advantage of those policies, you are much less likely to be on partnership track. Indeed, the first question you should ask when they tell you about those policies is, and how many partners took advantage of them? You're discriminated against because the caring that you're doing is devalued. That's at the top. It's much graver at the bottom, right? We have what I call an unlovely symmetry. Too few women at the top and far too many women at the bottom. And a majority of minimum wage workers are women, 2/3 of shift workers are women. The poorest people in our society are overwhelmingly single mothers who are the caregivers and breadwinners both. So if you're at the bottom, that care is devalued because we don't choose to make it possible for you to work and have somebody else take care of your children. We don't make it possible for you, if your child is sick, to miss a day of work without risking your job or certainly not getting that day's pay. We have no support for your caregiving, but we have plenty of respect for your breadwinning. We require it. That was what welfare reform was about, and I believe in the value of work. But you can't do that without supporting care. So if you look at this issue not as a women's issue, but a care issue, as a issue for couples, as an issue for workplaces, and as an issue for our society, you can see similarities in the issues of the majority of American women and of what has been traditionally fairly affluent white feminism. So we start by thinking about it in terms of making room for care. So the second piece of this, and it obviously follows from my insisting that it's not a women's problem, is if you're going to have a full revolution, then you have to change men's roles as much as women's roles. And again, this is very logical. You had a world in which to be a man meant to support your family. You had a job and you worked for your life to support your family. And to be a woman meant to bear the children and raise that family in the majority of cases. So then you changed women's roles dramatically. And again, you said, women now can or must be in the workforce, but nope, men just keep going exactly as they've always gone. That's a halfway revolution, and it won't work. And it's why then, women, after they have kids, end up still supporting their husband's career much more than men are supporting their wife's career. I came to this because men wrote to me. I did not believe this 3 years ago either. Men wrote to me and said, you think we have it all. You think that what women want is to be where men are, which is to be primarily breadwinners, but to fit caregiving in around the edges. But that's not what I want as a man. I would much rather be far more engaged in my children's lives. I would much rather be the coach of their games and be there and be able to take time out and work flexibly. Absolutely, I want to do that. And I want to see far more of my children than I saw of my father. That's been a big driver in a lot of men who, didn't see their fathers. One guy wrote to me and he said, okay, you're reading this and you're thinking, fine, this guy may want this, but not every guy. That's crazy. And I was kind of thinking that as I was reading it. He was right. And then he said in the letter, and I reprint this in the book, he said, in the 50s and 60s, men didn't think women wanted to be in the workforce. And I'm old enough to remember that. Men saying, no, my wife loves being at home. Women are feminine, they're nurturers. They don't want to be in that rough and tumble competitive work world. I remember all that. And I remember, having to act really dumb to get any guy to take me out. Because, to be feminine was not to be smart and not to be competitive. And when I went out to play tennis, my father once said, don't lose your head and win. Right? So, but his point was that's what men thought women wanted, and we proved them differently. So who are we now to say we know what men want? Why are we so sure that men like the roles that they were socialized into when we didn't like the roles we were socialized into? And I remember a partner in a law firm saying to me, a lot of our associates aren't that happy, but the women are far more likely to say, I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to go work in public interest. I'm going to do something completely different. The men may be equally unhappy, but they're much less likely to jump. Why? Because they're socialized to be told, you can't jump. You may not like this, but your job is to support your family. So we've have to see this in terms of men being able not only to have the joys of being invested in their loved ones the same way women do, but also to have the freedom to invest in all sorts of things, to not always be the breadwinner, to have any couple decide, as a same-sex couple would decide, okay, one of us, who's more ambitious? Who's got a more flexible job? Who's got a better boss? What do we want as individuals? Those are the criteria we should use for women and for men to get to real equality. All right, the last thing I will say is we can't get there. We cannot get to where we need to go, even with men as much a part of this conversation as women, unless we can't do this individually, company by company, CEO by CEO. We have to do this collectively. We have to actually build an infrastructure of care through the political system. And somebody asked me before, what do you take away from your book tour? And I said, the saddest thing is how many audiences just believe we cannot make positive change through the political system. We just can't do it. I just don't agree. I know how dysfunctional Washington is. I live there half the time. I know that. But, 100 years ago, there were no limits to how many hours you could ask somebody to work. Right? I mean, remember Muller v. Oregon, right? I can talk to a law class who actually knows what I'm talking about. It was a violation of contract to regulate employers to tell them that they could not work their workers 16-hour days. And yet somehow we did manage to get health and safety regulation in there. And in 1971, we were this close to having universal daycare, right? Both houses of Congress had passed it, and Nixon vetoed it with a bipartisan majority. This is a question of standing up and saying, no, as citizens, this is an economic issue, it's a middle class issue. Daycare costs more than rent in all 50 states. And that's driving women out of the workforce. We're now behind Japan. If you read Gail Collins in the Times 2 weeks ago, Japan has more women in the workforce than we do because Abe knows that's critical to his GDP growth, and he's providing care. He's providing daycare. He's making it easy for women to have families. So we have to stand up and insist that this is what we need to be competitive as a country, frankly, to invest in the next generation, and we can do it. Hillary Clinton, this is a huge part of her platform. Bernie Sanders, the same. But Marco Rubio's also put forward a plan for paid leave. And I may disagree on the details, but I am all for the fact that he sees this as a critical issue. And it's not a women's issue. It is a couples issue, it's a human issue, it's a social issue. So let me end by telling you why actually I am optimistic. And the worst thing about the last 3 years has been being introduced as, this is Anne Marie Slaughter, and she says women can't have it all. And I just, it's like, where do I start? Nobody, this is the United States, right? This is, of course you can do it, absolutely. So the message of unfinished business is we can finish this revolution. We absolutely can finish this resolution. And the reason I believe we can is because in Virginia in the 60s, my mother would set out little vases of cigarettes at dinner parties. That was what you did when you had a dinner party. You put out coffee cups and vases of cigarettes. I think you might get sued in New York if you did that today. I'm not sure if you can smoke in your own home or not, but I can't imagine anybody giving a dinner party and doing that, right? We've totally revolutionized the way we think about smoking. It's not cool anymore, and you certainly don't offer cigarettes to others. When I was growing up, Loving v. Virginia hadn't been decided. It was decided in 1967, so for the first 9 years of my life, it was illegal for a black person and a white person to marry. And, we've got plenty of racism still in this society, but we've come a long way from that. And finally, 5 years ago, even 5 years ago, I would not have believed we could have same-sex marriage in all 50 states. 20 years ago, you couldn't have articulated the term. Even 10 years ago, that would have been hard. And look how fast that change happened when we put our minds to it and when we changed the culture and we changed workplaces and we changed public policy. And that's what we have to do to finish the business of the women's movement, to get to not advancement of women, but real equality for women and men. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Slaughter, so much for coming to speak with us today. Just to start things off, so your book largely focuses on people who are at a stage of life, typically after law school, where they're confronted with how to navigate the working world in a way that makes them feel fulfilled, successful, all that good stuff. Thinking about our audience, people still in law school, what are practical ways in which these values can be instilled in people before they enter the workforce? And then to borrow a phrase from your book, how can universities help with the project of resocializing men and women to place more value on care?
That's a great question. So all of you can do a lot. I mean, in the first place, you can make these discussions that involve men as much as women. And I write in the book about having conversations with Princeton students, and we're talking about foreign policy, and everybody's talking. And then somebody would ask me about the article, and all the men would go silent for the rest of the conversation, right? And now partly they were terrified of saying something that somebody was going to land on them for, but partly they immediately felt this isn't my conversation. This is the women's conversation. So, you know, for the women in this audience, you need to bring men into the conversation, and for the men in the audience, you need to insist, this is my issue too, right? If I am a feminist, and I'm going to guess that the men in this room would define themselves as feminists, I believe in the equality of men and women. How are we going to get there, and what does that mean for me? Because that equality then means equality of trade-offs. It doesn't just mean, in theory, supporting your wife's career. It may mean doing what my husband's done, which is to say, when I got a big job, you know, he moved from Harvard to Princeton, although, as Justice Elena Kagan once said, who is a close friend, in the annals of spousal sacrifice, moving from Harvard to Princeton really doesn't cut it. But point being, you can have those conversations. Those of you who are, you know, have a significant other can start to talk about this now. And I have a set of questions in the book that sort of says, you know, you really need to get at the meat of what it looks like going forward. The other thing you can do is make a pact to have all the guys you know ask about family policies when you interview at law firms, right? And compare notes afterwards if you didn't ask, and discover that the women got told about these policies and the guys didn't. That is a really big problem. That is saying, once again, well, yeah, in this firm, you know, we've got policies for the women whose job it is to raise the children, but men, of course, we assume that, you know, you would not take advantage of these policies. Somebody told me last night that a senior partner, when rolling out the parental policies, said to the men at the firm, here are these policies, but of course, none of you would be wuss enough to take advantage of them. Direct quote. So you can also talk about, you know, how do you make pacts to insist that the men are going to talk about this too and not make it a women's issue. And the last thing I'll say in terms of what can the university do, to all my colleagues, to all faculty members, the most important thing that every faculty member could do is, to the extent you talk to a woman about how she's going to navigate work and family, start talking to all your male students too. My last year at Princeton, every guy who came into my office, I would say, I don't know if you're planning to have a family, but if you are, have you thought about how you're going to navigate a foreign policy career, which involves lots of travel, and having that family? And so we, from the beginning, say this is all of our responsibility.
So just to follow up on that question, as one of the leaders of Law Women, we're often looked to as an organization to raise these concerns, to hold panels, to give advice. And as you just said in your book, you challenge the idea that women should be the ones to have these conversations, and you directly credit receiving feedback from men helping you come to this conclusion. I guess practically speaking, in both organizations and in the workforce, who should be leading these conversations? What types of committees or organizations do we need, and how do we get them? How do we transition from having the women's group at the law firm or law women be the only people to hold these types of conversations?
It's a great question. And to some extent, this is, again, both and. You know, it's always the question. It's a question with race, too. You know, if you want it to be different, but you have to acknowledge the reality that is. So you sort of have to do both. But here's what I recommend people do in the workplace. You have work better groups, because this is what this is about. How can we work more effectively and more productively, given that many of us also have care obligations, and probably all of us would like a life, right? You know, self-care, pursuing your passions. At the heart of the book is an argument about that I got from a philosopher who wrote a little book called On Caring in 1971 about how investing in others is the same as investing in an artistic creation. It's the same process of kind of, it's yours, but it's not yours at the same time. So put together at PIMCO, the investment management fund, they have a PIMCO Parents. So that's one, you can start with parents, but I would go further and say, you know, we're really thinking about how do we modify the workplace to allow us to be fully productive, loyal, happy people in a world where technology does allow for much more flexibility, and you present that in terms of a millennial issue more than anything else.
And I guess on that note, I mean, you make a very compelling case, and I agree with you, that we should elevate care and how important care is, not only from a financial, that we should be, you know, putting more resources into caring, but also that there are societal benefits outside of the economic benefit. But it seems like one of the ways that we approach this is by arguing to corporations, like, you should really care about care because happy workers make better products. So it seems like the way that we argue it is that there's a business incentive to invest in care. So I guess my question is, are we really elevating care, or are we strategically paying lip service to it?
Wow, that is a... You should go to law school. There are many versions of that question, but that was as concise and hard-hitting as I've heard. So I wrestle with this. And I've also had women in my audiences, older women, and this book also is for people who are ready for, at my age, who are ready for the next phase of their careers, say to me exactly that. Say, you know, you're not standing up there and saying that my life investing in others and building my family stands alone as value. You are tying that to what it does for us in the workplace. And so some of my answer is, yeah, this is reality, and I think this is the best way to make the argument, and I'm a lawyer, but the deeper argument is, I do think most human beings are happiest when they have both. In other words, growing up with my mother, who was a fabulous mother. I mean, this is not the Waltons. This was not a perfect family by any stretch. I mean, we had plenty of, you know, ups and downs like any family, but she was absolutely great at raising a family, but she would have been happier if she could have been a professional artist at the same time. And so I hesitate to say, sure, you know, we should just flip it. So men should be able to be the lead parent, the full-time lead parent, and women will be in the workforce. Because I do genuinely believe, I think that most of us have both these elements. It's like Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own. You know, if you're just defined in terms of your relationships to others, many of us crave a room of our own, to be our own selves. But many of us want that room to be in a bigger house filled with people we love, whether that's biological or constructed. So that's the deeper reason. But I would love to be able to get to a place where you could make the argument that just says, if you say I'm a mother or I'm a father or I'm caring for my mother or I'm caring for my father, we would just see that as absolutely as important as I am bringing in however much money I'm bringing in.
So this is, and you've been very frank in your book about this, that a lot of your thinking has changed in the past 3 years. and that you speak from a certain position of privilege and of power. And I guess you engage with the fact now that white upper middle class women made progress professionally on the backs of women of lower socioeconomic means who were the ones who bore the brunt of the caregiving and the child care responsibilities. And you write in this book, what unites all women is the struggle to combine competition and care in a system that rewards one and penalizes the other. So I guess what I'm interested in hearing from you is, what are the larger policy changes that we need to make that statement a reality? Because as it currently stands, this is still what's happening. You know, wealthier women are still relying on women of lower socioeconomic means to take care of their children. So besides for the individual advice that we can give of leaning in or having conversations with your boss, what are the larger structural policy changes that we can fight for to make this a bigger reality?
So two ways. So one, again, building the infrastructure of care that I talk about, which every other developed country has, right? I mean, we don't even have paid maternity leave, so we're just talking about paid maternity, paternity, family leave, access to quality child care and elder care. That's the basics. That infrastructure will help women at the bottom much more than it will help the women in this room, because we work for places that certainly give us leave and give you maternity and increasingly paternity, and the rest of it we buy our way out of. Right? Exactly, by hiring often women of color, certainly lower income people, to do that. So part of my answer is simply by framing it in terms of care and a social issue, that pushes you not toward discrimination against women in the workforce. It pushes you toward the feminism that costs money rather than the feminism that doesn't. And that we have to grapple with that, e.g. money, our tax money, money for corporations where they're actually going to have to pay for something. So I think that's a large part of it. But the other piece, and I haven't gone into this, is the Pentagon understands how important this is. Right? The Pentagon actually has on-site daycare, and they pay their daycare workers, their early education teachers, as much as they pay their elementary and secondary school teachers. So the other part of this is to emphasize that, you know, most of the problems in this country could be addressed in a major way. I'm not going to say they'd be all solved. If we invested in the first 5 years of all children's lives equally, because we now know that those first 5 years, you're not just teaching a child, you are shaping that child's brain, and you're determining that child's ability to learn for the rest of his or her life. And the Pentagon gets that as a national security issue. They are actively worried that they're not going to have people who are going to be able to operate the weapons of the future. So that's the other way that I think I mean, that may not be the best argument overall, but you know, to be competitive. But the other place we do this is we really do break open, wait a minute, what are we talking about when we talk about care? Same thing with elder care. And there we just appeal to basic self-interest, right? Do you want somebody taking care of you who is not even making a living wage and is incredibly stressed and has had very little training in terms of how actually to allow you to have your best day? So that's how I would frame those issues.
So in the same vein of getting companies to value care that you discussed earlier, you write about things such as training your boss or managing up. Things that we can do sort of on this individual level in order to make that expectation happen. But again, when you have employees on sort of the lower socioeconomic threshold that aren't able to speak with their bosses about these things, sort of what are some of the strategies that can be used? And specifically, I'm thinking about in the book the reference to the Starbucks employee who had no agency over her schedule at all.
Right.
And it wasn't until her story broke in the media where she had situations that she was closing the store at 1 in the morning,
Absolutely.
sleeping outside the store, and then opening it up at 4 or 5 in the morning, that it sort of led to this social revolution to change that practice, at least within Starbucks.
Within Starbucks, absolutely. So that one, I mean, that again, law can matter, right? I mean, you can insist that companies, period, but these are really large companies that use this flexible software, have to give people at least 2 weeks' notice of what their schedule is going to be. And that is clearly a care issue. I mean, how on earth at the last minute can you make arrangements? So you can make some progress there in terms of regulation. You can also, again, make this this is about having a more stable workforce, right? And you can look at the numbers, right? The churn because people can't manage it rather than actually making it possible for people to have basically a living wage, that's again becoming an economic issue. And that's the way I would fight that. The other piece of that, and this gets much beyond the book, but this is about also the future of work, right? If I were giving you a talk on the future of work, I would say the on-demand economy is here to stay and to grow. For those of you who are going to be juggling, you want to keep your hand in as lawyers, it's a godsend because you will be able to be caring for your child and work on a project basis. That's the high end. At the low end, and this goes directly to your question, lots of the people who were working at Starbucks are now Uber drivers or TaskRabbit or all of that, and that's just spreading. And every time I have an Uber driver, I ask why they're driving, and particularly if it's women, they say, this is a way I can make money and also care for my kids. Now, that economy will only work with a whole new infrastructure of portable benefits. Right? And so the way I make those arguments is not about women and not about care. This is what you're going to have to do to support the innovation and the flexibility and the creativity of this new economy, but you can't do it unless people can actually make a wage, support their family, buy a house, et cetera.
So on a personal note, while reading your book, for me, it felt like a series of sort of unspoken conversations or spoken and unspoken conversations between myself and my wife as we just sort of navigate this dual professional world with our 6-month-old child. And just sort of page by page, basically coming up with the implicit question of, is the professional success worth the family sacrifice? And professional success in whatever way one is defining that. And both of us sort of view it in our own ways, and we try to express that. I would like if you could speak a little bit more about some of I guess the word I'm looking for is the stigma attached that men see attached to the idea of wanting to be more of an active caregiver in the family. And because admittedly, that's something that's very present, this idea that, well, I'd like to be more of an active caregiver, but I also would like to fulfill
But I don't
this.
want to be a wuss.
Yeah, in so many words. Yeah, that's what comes to mind, even if it's in the back of the mind. And I think a lot of men feel that, unfortunately. And so I'd like if you just maybe talk a little bit more about how can men sort of play a better role in that conversation with their partners. Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked the question. So the reason it sounds like conversations between you and your wife is because it reflects conversations between me and my husband over many years, right? And again, we couldn't have anticipated how things were going to shake out. It just evolved. And he wrote this article called Why I Put My Wife's Career First that said, we started out as pretty much in the same place. I was already a professor. He was still finishing his dissertation. I got tenure first, so then he was an assistant professor. He was a political scientist, so he had a longer tenure track. I had a shorter one. So I was always one step ahead of him professionally, but then, once I got the offer to be a dean, well then, but that of course was a big thing for our family, because and a good thing. He's never understood why it's a problem that I out-earn him. He thinks he married really well. And so do my children, right? I mean, it's like, yeah, well, what's the problem with that? And my point to that is, I would rather earn money, and I'd rather support him with money, he'd rather support me with care. But so it is, I think this is the core of the issue, that absolutely, men, I can't tell you how often men say that, I'd love to work 75% time, you know, and be more, and can you imagine we all could go to work to 75% time when we had families, what that would do? I mean, it's perfectly possible. It's just the guy feels like he can't. So here's how I think men need to think about it. That the men who do this are really secure. It's interesting that the letters we've gotten the most, Andy and me together, the single biggest group from men we've heard from are men who are lead parents, are men in the military. And that's partly because if they're married to a soldier and she's deployed, see, he's lead parent. That's partly if he's deployed and his wife's not in the military and he comes back, he says, it's my wife's turn. You know, that's what equality means, it's my wife's turn. I think this is significant because I think military men are not worried about their masculinity, or much less worried about their masculinity. And so I think that's important. So the men who do this are really secure, and they're really confident. And my husband has never doubted that he's a man, and nobody else does either. So that's part of it. I think what we say is those men are pioneers. Those men are breaking the mold. Those men have the guts to challenge a gender stereotype like the women did in the early 70s. And those women in the early 70s were called every name in the book, and most of those names revolved around how they were not feminine, right? I won't repeat them, but you can fill in the blanks. It was they're wearing the pants in the family, you know, they're betraying their gender. So they challenge notions of femininity, and men who are willing to do this now are real pioneers. The second thing I would say about that is something's happening out there, because Madison Avenue is now marketing to lead parent men. Even The Economist had UBS, an investment bank, and the Swiss are not known for progressiveness on this issue. You know, a man saying, am I a good father, sitting in his office? You know, am I spending enough time at home? Do I have it all? That's a quote from the ad. And Honda Civic is advertising a Civic for soccer dads. Right? And it says, it goes all through, you know, soccer dads and how soccer dads are coaching teams. And we know, by the way, that men, you know, dads who are more at home, it's great for their daughters. But the tagline says, the Honda Civic, it's big enough for you, your kids, and your self-respect. So, you know,
They're trying.
they're investing a lot of money on ad campaigns. They're clearly responding to something. So the way I think, you challenge this. I think this is a conversation for the women too. Right? We are so guilty of saying, oh yes, absolutely, we want a man who will support our career, but we don't want a man who's going to be a lead parent. That doesn't work, right? I look at my husband and I think I'm incredibly lucky because I found a guy who is a fabulous guy who is willing to support my career in the way I need it supported. So he's a feminist, he's secure, and he's breaking the mold.
So as a follow-up to that question, you also write about conversations you've had with same-sex couples who have told you that being in a same-sex relationship has freed them of some of the traditional barriers, I guess, assigned to specific gendered roles. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about those conversations.
At the center of the book is a description of two friends of mine who got married and have 4-year-old twins. And they're both psychiatrists. And they had to figure out when they had their twins which of them was going to, you know, spend more working and which was going to spend more time with the children. And, you know, the way they decided to sort this out, they're two women, the way it was exactly a question of who was older, who's making more, certainly matters, who was older, who wanted to be home more, who, you know, how they imagined both their careers evolving, who had a better boss. There were all these questions that are the right questions to ask. And so what I argue is that same-sex couples are really leading the way because they are able to have this conversation without a gender default, without the assumption that, well, but you're the man, so your job is really to be the breadwinner, and I'm the woman, so my job is really to be the caregiver. And that if that's the lenses we need for all couples.
So switching gears a little bit, and this is something I asked you about a little bit before that I'm really interested in. You, in a recent interview, you said you didn't want to write this book, that you wanted to write a foreign policy book.
I still do.
But that the response to your article was so overwhelming that it kind of pushed you to continue this conversation. And as someone whose expertise is foreign policy, this is what you went to school for, this is presumably what you wanted to do, is taking on this mantle of being one of the people to have these conversations and bring it to the masses. Is this something you're excited about, you're ambivalent about? Because I imagine it could be difficult thinking like, okay, now I'm being known for this, even though I went to school to be known for X.
Yes.
But you also want people to care about care, so how do you not?
No, it's a great question. And when I published the article, and you have to know that the week before the article came out, The Atlantic was trying to get me on TV, and all these places said, no way. I mean, it was just like, this is boring. She's saying the same thing people have written, and that's true. People had written versions of the article for 20 years. And then it hit, and I was in Scotland giving a speech on vacation with my husband and our sons, trying to put it all together. And by the time I get back 2 days later, 400,000 page views, and I'm on the front page of the New York Times juxtaposed against Sheryl Sandberg. And my mother calls me up, to your point, and my wonderful mother, and says, "What have you done?" And what she was saying was, and it was like this wave that was just erasing my whole identity, and the people never are going to know that I write about Syria or anything else now know, this is Anne-Marie Slaughter, she wrote this article. And so yes, ambivalence is, I think, the right way to describe it. That there, I am writing that foreign policy book now, and I said to my husband this weekend, it's just, oh my God, I'm back on my home turf. I know what I think. It just feels so great. This is what I was trained to do. But what I said to you before is true. I have to walk my own talk. Right? I cannot tell you that care is as important as what we do in our professional lives, and then say, yeah, but I'm much more comfortable being known for foreign policy than talking about this soft peripheral stuff, which is still how most of the people in my world see it, right? When people say, oh, you have a new book out, and I say, yeah, it's on work and family, and so I have to fight that by having these conversations, and I have to insist that no, this may well be by far the most important thing I did in my life. I have no idea what I will or will not do in foreign policy, but I do believe that a society in which we can all be fully human and fully engaged with all sides of us is as important as world peace, and I'm not going to create world peace either. Though I do just have to tell one little story there. My son, the one I wrote about, who I came home for, about 2 years after I was home, he's reading the Times about Syria, and he looks at me and he says, Mom, if you'd stayed in the State Department, could you have fixed Syria? And because you could see, he's like thinking, oh my God, she came home for me and a whole country. I'm like, no, sweetie, I promise you, I could not have fixed Syria. So.
One thing, especially because you have this platform, there are people who have focused on this work, and
Yes.
you talk about them. Asian Poo is someone who you mentioned in the book, and are there any other people whom you've engaged with on these topics whose work you want to highlight and kind
Oh,
of?
yes. Well, yeah, Ai-jen Poo. So Carol, to start with, who has spent her life working on these issues. And if you haven't read her work, you should. Joining the Resistance was her latest book, and it's just fabulous. So, and so many scholars. I mean, and I list them, Claudia Golden, who's just done amazing work, many people. In terms of the activists, yes, Ai-jen Poo, caring across generations for elder care, for unionizing care workers, this is hugely important. The Work in Families and Work Institute here in New York, Ellen Galinsky's work is incredible. There's a new organization called Open Work that I'm on the board of, and this goes back to your point about how do you sell this. Open Work is open working is like open data, open source, open gov. It is how we work in the digital age. And if you go on the website, there are examples of all different kinds of companies who are pioneering new ways of working. And then there's the, Ellen Bravo's organization. There's Making Work Work, and then I think it's called Families at Work. But many, many people who have been in these trenches, and all I'm able to do is, elevate their work a little bit.
Should we go to the audience?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're at the point where we are opening this up to the audience for Q&A. Oh, immediately we have hands. Awesome.
Hello, and thank you. My name is Courtney, and my question is about, we've talked a lot about bringing men into conversations like this, and I'm wondering, as a young person, a millennial in the workforce, how you think intergenerational conversations would go, especially when a lot of times the people who are senior have different perspectives about this than we're seeing in tech industries and startup culture. The millennials are different, thinking things a little differently, but if you're in a more traditional space, how should we have these conversations with people who maybe are bosses?
Yep. So the secret feminist weapon are senior men with daughters. And not because, I know I've just read this study that CEOs who have daughters are more, just have better policies overall, but that's not it. It's that when you have a senior man who undoubtedly never thought about this issue when he was coming up, but now has a millennial daughter or a Gen X daughter who is the, fabulous, she's his daughter after all, and he's invested in her education, and she has been having a career, but now has his grandchild. And lo and behold, encounters all the barriers that he is happily reinforcing in his firm, but that he sees very differently through her eyes. So that is, and often what women tell me is that men with daughters are far better bosses than older women who had to make it in a very tough environment. And like everybody, like doctors who went through 36-hour residencies, you got to do it the same way I do. So I think that actually is a sort of a place you want to figure out who those people are, and you want to have that conversation more with them about what you can do. More generally also, again, this should be about how can this firm retain the talent, right? That, you're investing in all these wonderful women and you're losing them, and a fair number of men. It's just less visible that you're losing men. So you have that conversation that way too. The other thing I will just say though about intergenerational, it's not just young men we have to talk to, and it's not just young women. One of the things that happens if you are a couple and the man is the lead parent, your parents can be trouble, and his parents can be trouble, right? That they still expect him to support you. And even in my own family, periodically, somebody will say, if we're doing something, and my mother might say, well, Andy's earning too, isn't he? And I will say, yeah, but he's doing the work that allows me to earn our living. And so you really have to tackle the sort of denigration of any non-traditional male role from the in-laws perspective as well.
Hi, how are you? I'm Hannah. I had a question speaking to the idea about opening up the conversation so that it's not just about women, it's really about men and women together, that it invites a sort of a threat to erode at these women power groups that are very, very entrenched across in law firms, even in student groups. And how would you guide reconciling the two, that we open up the conversation, but we also want to protect these types of empowerment groups that I still think are very important? Or would you say that the end all and be all would to not have a purpose for those groups?
That's an an interesting question. I mean, I certainly wouldn't say now, let's not have those groups, because they are important. I do worry that they reinforce certain narratives that I think are actually changing. Because a lot of those women are older, and that's the way it was when they came up, and it may not be quite the same way, or the attitudes may not be the same. But I think I would not challenge them. What I would do is what I would really like to see is, as I said, I'd like to see audiences of millennial couples, same-sex or heterosexual or however you construct a family, asking the question, how are we as a generation going to have a better life for us and our families, our children or our parents, than our parents did? That's the right question to ask. That my husband said, I want a different relationship with my kids than I had with my father. He loved his father, but his father wasn't there. And so the way this has to really be framed is I would say, as how are millennial revolution is too strong, but it's how are we going to remake the workplace? How are we going to remake expectations of our careers? And how to think about that in terms of, you can call it work-life, you can call, and maybe that works in terms of, how are we going to have the lives that we want? And thinking, and I can't give you exactly the name of the organization, but the ideal would be for a group of men and women to create that organization, and then, as I said, to be thinking about, okay, here's what we're going to ask companies, here's what we're going to agitate for, here's what we're going to ask faculty to do, because this is the way we are framing this issue. The one other thing I'll just say, because this goes to your question about what can all of you do, here's another thing you can do that makes an enormous difference. Stop asking people, what do you do? I mean it. I'm really serious about that. The first thing we do, Americans, when we meet people, is we say, what do you do? And there's a great egalitarian story about this, that you can be anybody, and it's not about what class you are, but what it does, if you ask that question immediately and the person says, doesn't have an answer that involves earning money, that person's devalued. So try asking, have you read a good book recently? What are your hobbies? Have you seen a good movie? Just try anything that acknowledges that there's more to a person than work. Just try it. It's really kind of out there to be talking to somebody when you don't know what they do. Europeans think it's rude to ask what you do, right? And they think we're unbelievably boring because we talk about work all the time. So.
Thank you very much for being with us. My name is Victoria, and I, in my undergraduate career, did a lot of research and came to the same conclusions you did about the importance of building coalitions and also advocating for a political structure that will support care. I worked in the Senate, at the White House, and at the Department of Labor trying to figure out how to find a federal solution for these issues, and found that due to an inhospitable kind of climate in Congress and just the struggle to really be able to find people that will advocate for these policies, a lot of the fight was going to the states and kind of away from the federal lens. So I'm wondering what branch you think that this kind of change will emanate from, and how far away we are from getting this kind of federal benchmark passed for the United States.
So I would not focus on the federal government right now. Now, again, depending who wins the next election and what that looks like, maybe. But even so, Congress, we are in the equivalent of when the Bull Moose Party, split the Republican Party, and we're in a time of turmoil before we get people who are going to be able to pass laws. States for sure, but the place I look to first is cities. Right? So the Labor Department is working with 10 cities across the country, and they're red state cities as well as blue state cities, on paid leave. And Cincinnati just adopted paid leave. And Washington, D.C. just offered 16 weeks of paid leave. Right? So I think cities, and again, if you look at Seattle or you look at L.A., you look at minimum wage issues, cities have the ability to get this done. and a lot of economic clout. And then from cities, I think, to states. So New Jersey has paid leave, right? Corzine got paid leave through in New Jersey, and Rhode Island has it, and California has it. So those are the places I think are most promising. And then as we prove that, of course, you can have this infrastructure and the world does not come to an end and every corporation does not leave you and they adapt like they've adapted to lots of other things, then you have a stronger argument, I think, in Congress.
Hi, Anne-Marie. My name's Jennifer, and I want to thank you very much for what comes across as just brutal, brutal honesty of self-reflection, and I really think that comes through, and I appreciate it. My question is directed a little bit, I don't think it's off topic, but it's something you may not have addressed directly, and that is the issue of when the primary caregiver leaves the workforce entirely and then wants to re-enter, either to have raised children or to take care of parents or both.
Yep.
Because it seems to me that that is the ultimately devalued position for re-entry into the workforce. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on that. Thank
No,
you.
I actually talk about that a lot. And then when the first thing to say is that we have in our minds what one woman said to me recently. She said she had been a prosecutor and she had left to take care of her kids, and now her kids had gone to college, and people are saying to her, "Are you going to retire?" And she's in her late 50s, and she's going, retire? You know, her life expectancy is mid-80s. What on earth is she going to do? That's 25 years. I mean, 25 years is the difference between 25 and 50. And so the first thing I point out is that's what I call phase 3. And that's for everybody. That's phase 3. You've got, an intense pre-care phase if you're going to have kids or caring for your own parents, and you may have multiple. You've got then the sort of more care-focused period, and then you got phase 3. And the example I use is Hillary Clinton, who did not run for office on her own until Chelsea went to college. Right? She was the first lady of Arkansas, and she was the first lady, obviously, of the country. She'd been a very successful lawyer, but she tailed that back when Chelsea was born. Chelsea goes to college, and then suddenly look at her phase 3. And if she's elected, she'll be 70, and so we're looking much longer. So that's the first point, is we need to be thinking about the talent pool out there of phase 3, mostly women. Second is, it is a huge talent pool. Those women are highly educated, and they're raring to go. Companies are starting returnships. And this is something that we should be pushing for through chambers of commerce. The big investment banks have returnships. Both Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan all have ways where they're reaching out to women who were in finance and saying, come back in and we'll rotate you around just like you do it with an intern and help you figure out where you want to get back involved. And there's some confidence building there, there's some training on technology, but these are also women who, many of them have raised families and have enormous abilities, to organize, to do all the things you do with children. So that is something that I think you will, again, approach as an economic issue, that there's a huge talent pool, and in a country that keeps saying we've got this huge talent shortage, there it is. And then here are concretely how you actually let women get back in. For the women who haven't left, I say try to keep your hand in if you can. This is why I think on demand at the high end actually helps. Whoever's telling us.
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
I think we're out of
so
time.
thank you all. This
Thank you
was
very much.
the conversation I expected.